Welcome to the What Does Science Say channel. Today, we are taking a deep dive into multiple sclerosis, or MS. It's a topic that, well, it touches millions of lives, and it's just a fascinating scientific puzzle.
It really is.
And we've been really digging into a whole collection of sources for this deep dive, everything from quite technical research papers and news reports
Mhm.
to some incredibly moving and honestly insightful personal stories from people living with MS right now.
Yeah, those sources give such a rich picture, don't they? You get the clinical side, but also that very real human experience.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to sift through all this material, pull out the most important insights we can find. We want to understand what these sources are telling us about the potential causes of MS,
Yeah.
especially that question of why it seems to pop up so often in certain families. And then also look at the latest perspectives on, well, managing life with the disease and where the research is heading.
And what really jumps out looking across everything is just how complex MS is understood to be.
Definitely. It's not one single thing causing it. The sources all seem to agree it's more like a complicated interplay. Genes, environment, lifestyle factors all mixed together.
That complexity really is the core theme, I think. It comes up again and again.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this complex picture of MS and maybe start with something a bit surprising that quite a few sources highlighted.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how the research kind of pushes back against a common assumption.
Mm.
Even though MS often appears in multiple family members,
Mm-hmm.
the sources are pretty clear. It is not directly inherited. Not in that straightforward way, anyway. There isn't like a single gene passed down that guarantees someone will get MS.
And the general statistics really drive that point home, don't they? They offer a different perspective compared to those really powerful family stories.
They do.
The average risk for anyone in the general population is actually quite low, about 1 in 7 to 50, the sources say.
Right.
Now, if a parent has MS, the risk for their child goes up, but it's still, relatively speaking, quite small, around 1.5%. That's like 1 in 67. And for a sibling, it's a bit higher, again, maybe 2.7%, which works out to roughly 1 in 37.
Those numbers give important context. But like you said, they can feel, well, almost meaningless when you hear some of the personal accounts included in the sources.
Absolutely. I mean, I was really struck by that Reddit user story. Their father, their aunt, and their sister all have MS, and now they've been diagnosed too.
Wow.
And then there's that other incredible example from one family mentioned where out of 8 siblings, 7 of them had MS.
7 out of 8.
Yeah. And then among their children, 35 kids in total, 13 developed MS. I mean,
Wow.
when you see patterns like that,
Yeah.
the average statistics just seem to fade into the background. You really feel the weight of that family connection. It just makes you ask, okay, if it's not one single gene, what is going on there?
And that's exactly the puzzle researchers are trying to piece together. The sources explain that while there's no single MS gene, they've actually identified over 200 different genes that are associated with an increased risk of developing MS.
Over 200.
Yeah. And a key area they focus on is something called the major histocompatibility complex genes, or MHC genes.
Okay, MHC genes. What do they actually do? Why are they seen as so important for MS risk?
So the MHD genes are really critical players in our immune system. They essentially help our body tell the difference between our own healthy cells and foreign invaders like
Okay.
viruses or bacteria.
Got it, like a security system.
Exactly. And variations, little differences in these MHC genes can affect how that immune system functions. The thinking is that certain variations might make someone's immune system, well, more prone to mistakenly attacking the body's own myelin sheath, that protective covering around nerve fibers. And that's what happens in MS.
So it's like having a slightly glitchy threat detection system.
That's actually a pretty good way to put it. And researchers are digging even deeper now, looking at specific genetic patterns within those high-risk families you mentioned earlier.
Like that MS family study.
Precisely. That study, highlighted in the sources, is actively searching for shared genetic changes, things that are unique to families where you have, say, 3 or more close relatives with MS.
Okay.
The hope is, if they can find these specific genetic signatures, it could unlock vital clues about how MS actually starts. And maybe, just maybe, how to stop it.
That sounds incredibly important. Were there other specific genetic findings that stood out in the sources?
Yes, there was a really compelling Canadian study mentioned. They identified a specific, quite rare genetic mutation in 2 families. And these families had a particularly rapidly progressive form of MS.
And what was the link?
What was really striking was that a significant chunk, 2/3 of the people in those families who carried that specific mutation, actually went on to develop MS.
Wow, two-thirds.
Yeah. So the sources suggest that maybe for people in families known to be at very high risk like that, screening for this specific mutation could potentially lead to much earlier diagnosis.
And earlier treatment.
Exactly. Getting a jump on it before too much damage is done.
That could be huge. I also saw something mention from a study in a Dutch population hinting at a maternal parent of origin effect. What's that about?
Yeah, that finding was really intriguing. It suggested that in that specific group they studied, MS patients were more often related through their mother's side of the family than their father's.
Oh,
Now, it doesn't mean MS is only passed down through mothers, not at all. But it does raise the possibility that there might be these complex interactions happening,
yeah.
maybe involving genes and environmental factors
Yeah.
that are somehow influenced more by the maternal line.
Okay.
It just adds, another layer of complexity to that whole genetic picture.
It really does. It shows how tangled these genetic pieces can be beyond just finding individual risk genes. But as the sources keep emphasizing, genes are definitely not the whole story.
Not by a long shot.
So what else did these materials point to? What other contributors to MS risk came up?
Well, if we zoom out from the pure genetics, the sources strongly suggest that our environment and our lifestyle are sort of crucial partners in this, often interacting with that underlying genetic susceptibility.
Okay, so what were some of the big environmental links discussed?
One that came up again and again was the Epstein-Barr virus, EBV.
Yes, EBV.
There's a pretty compelling theory, and it's backed by research in the sources, suggesting that EBV might actually be able to trigger MS in some people.
And EBV is the virus that causes mono, right? Glandular fever. Most people get it at some point.
Exactly. Most of us encounter it, often without even knowing, but yeah, it's the monovirus.
And people who've had it carry antibodies. I remember reading some patient accounts where people felt pretty strongly that their MS started, not long after they'd had a bad bout of mono, or even shingles sometimes.
Precisely. And the research is really trying to understand why. Why might EBV exposure set the stage for MS, but only in certain genetically susceptible individuals? It's a key question.
Makes sense. What else?
Another factor consistently linked is low vitamin D levels.
Right, the sunshine vitamin.
Yeah. And the sources highlighted how some neurologists are actually advising high-dose vitamin D3 supplements as a potential preventative measure, especially for the children of parents who have MS.
That's interesting, a concrete action step mentioned right there. And then there's that geographic pattern that's been observed for a long time.
Yes, that observation that MS seems to be more common in people with Northern European or Scandinavian ancestry,
Uh-huh.
and generally less common in populations maybe closer to the equator, or even groups like the Inuit in the far north, whose lifestyle and diet are adapted differently. One patient in the sources even speculated, could it be linked to less sun exposure in those northern places? Which, of course, ties right back to vitamin D.
It all seems interconnected. Were there other environmental things mentioned? Maybe less proven, but things people suspected?
Yeah, beyond those more widely studied links, some of the personal accounts brought up other possibilities based on individual experiences. Things like suspected chronic exposure to mold,
Oh,
or
right.
gas leaks, or maybe certain chemicals. People mentioned concerns about well water, insecticides, industrial chemicals. Now, these aren't as widely confirmed as, say, EBV or vitamin D in the big studies,
Right.
but they represent real concerns and experiences shared by patients, potential triggers in their own lives.
And then there are lifestyle factors too, right?
Absolutely. Smoking came up clearly.
Mm.
The sources show it increases the risk of actually developing MS in the first place.
I mean, does it affect progression?
Yes. On the flip side, the sources note that quitting smoking can actually help slow down the progression from relapsing MS to the secondary progressive form. So that's significant.
Diet also seemed to feature quite a bit in the patient stories.
It did. People shared their experiences trying things like gluten-free, dairy-free diets, or really focusing on avoiding processed foods, additives, MSG, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that story about the mother whose son had terrible stomach pain and doctors couldn't figure it out, but it got much better after they changed his diet. That really stuck with me.
It shows how, even if diet isn't seen as a cure in the medical sense, it can potentially have a real impact on managing symptoms for some people.
Absolutely. So when you pull all this together, the genetic predispositions, the viruses like EBV, vitamin levels, where you live, smoking, diet, what does this tell you, the listener?
Well, it suggests that for any one person, MS likely arises from this kind of confluence of factors, a whole mix of things. It's that complex interplay again, rather than just one single cause. It's like individual susceptibility meeting environmental triggers.
That wider view is really helpful. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit now. Moving from understanding the potential causes to what these sources tell us about, well, the actual experience of living with MS day to day and what's available in terms of treatment, support, and the research that's happening.
Yeah, and the patient perspectives and the sources are just invaluable here. They talk about that initial shock of diagnosis,
Mm.
the whole process of adjusting emotionally. One person described it as needing to unlearn the really negative expectations they had, maybe based on seeing how MS affected people years ago, before current treatments.
That makes sense.
And the sources also convey that very real emotional weight of, symptoms that fluctuate, the fear of what the future might hold in terms of progression.
But alongside those challenges, the sources definitely highlight resilience too, and the strategies people are using to live well with MS. What did you pick up about the actual treatments and interventions people mentioned?
Well, the disease-modifying therapies, DMTs, are obviously a major part of the picture.
Right.
The sources mention specific examples, like Ocrevus being used for primary progressive MS, and Tecfidera came up too. The main goal with these, as the material explains, is really to slow down the disease progression, mostly by kind of calming down that overactive immune system.
And what about treatments for specific symptoms? I think I saw something about help with walking.
Yes, drugs like Ampyra, or sometimes its compound form, aminopyridine, they were discussed for helping improve walking speed. But
Hmm.
the patient accounts offered a real dose of reality there. Experiences seemed quite mixed. Some people found it absolutely life-changing, while others reported, basically no benefit and sometimes difficult side effects like dizziness or itching.
So not a universal fix.
Not at all. And then there was that really compelling account from a patient who went abroad to undergo hematopoietic stem cell transplant, HSCT.
Right, the stem cell transplant.
Yeah, they reported their MS became inactive within about 5 months. They described HSCT as a therapy that, in some studies, has been shown to stop MS progression pretty significantly for many people. It's like rebooting the immune system using chemotherapy.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't repair damage that's already done, but this person felt their body was actually trying to do some repair work afterwards. And crucially, they no longer felt like they were inevitably headed for a wheelchair. That's a powerful example from the sources of a really high-intensity therapy option.
It really is. And the sources also seem to stress that treatment isn't just about these powerful medications, right?
Absolutely not. There's a really strong focus on integrating lifestyle factors. Sometimes it's called integrative medicine, or people talk about brain-healthy behaviors.
Like what specifically?
Things like maintaining a healthy diet, getting regular exercise, actively managing stress, maybe practicing meditation. These are presented as really crucial for building what they call neurologic reserve.
Neurologic reserve.
Yeah, it's like strengthening your brain and nervous system so they can better cope with the impact of any MS attacks or ongoing damage, making the system more resilient.
Okay, that makes sense. And I love the examples in the sources about purposeful activities. Things like weaving, playing guitar, gardening.
Yes, those weren't just hobbies. They contribute not just physically, maybe, but offer that valuable mind-body connection, a sense of purpose, hope.
Like that idea someone shared planting a seed implies you believe you'll be there to see it grow. For someone facing an unpredictable disease, that's, well, incredibly poignant.
It really is. But we also have to acknowledge the challenges in healthcare and research that came up quite strongly in these sources, too.
Yeah, what were some of those?
Health disparities are a big one. Patients and experts talked about people getting different levels of care based on things like race or where they live. One patient advocate shared the, frankly, shocking reality that even now, in 2024, some doctors are still mistakenly telling Black people they couldn't possibly have MS.
That's unbelievable. A clear example of bias directly impacting diagnosis.
Exactly. And access to specialists is another major hurdle, especially if you live in a rural area.
Right.
Plus, the sources touched on how historical injustices, like the Tuskegee experiment, which one advocate's father had learned about firsthand, contribute to this deep-seated distrust of the healthcare system in some communities. And that really impacts engagement with doctors and research.
And that distrust connects to participation in clinical trials, doesn't it?
Directly. The sources highlighted the really low participation rates for Black and Hispanic individuals in MS trials. Even though MS disproportionately affects Black people in the U.S., their representation in trials is often way under 5%. Hispanic participation is also worryingly low.
Which means the findings might not even apply properly to those groups.
Exactly. As one expert put it, you simply can't generalize study findings to everyone if key groups aren't properly represented in the research. It just underscores how vital it is to have more inclusive research design and outreach efforts. They mentioned the CHIMES trial as an example, which is specifically focusing on Black and Hispanic people with MS and actively involving patients in the process.
That's crucial. Did the sources mention other hurdles, maybe between research and actual practice?
Yeah, they touched on the difficulties in getting exciting research discoveries actually implemented widely in clinics. There are policy barriers, apparently. And researchers need to show more than just biological effects. They need data on the real-world benefits, the health economics, the impact on healthcare systems. Demonstrating how delaying disability by, say, 30% actually translates into someone staying employed longer or needing fewer hospital visits.
Showing the bigger picture value.
Right. And from the patient's side, there's this strong desire for more personalized guidance on treatments. One person shared their frustration being given a list of DMTs and basically told to pick one. Even having a science background themselves felt like a total guessing game without more tailored information for their specific situation.
That sounds incredibly difficult. All of this really seems to point back to the importance of, well, patient empowerment and the strength you can get from the MS community.
Definitely. Those themes came through loud and clear in the personal stories. The sources really emphasize the value of building your own healthcare team, really engaging in shared decision-making with your doctors, and not being afraid to seek second opinions if you need to.
And the community itself.
The MS family, as people call it, is highlighted as just invaluable for peer support, for sharing practical tips, for navigating the often confusing healthcare system.
And for research, too.
Yeah, participating in research. And this doesn't just mean drug trials. It could be registries, lifestyle surveys, things like that, is presented as a really powerful way for individuals to contribute.
Yeah.
To help everyone understand MS better and improve care down the line. Every bit of shared data helps build that clearer picture.
So if we kind of tie all these threads together, looking at the big picture, it's really clear that tackling MS effectively needs this truly multifaceted approach. It's not just about the medical treatments targeting the disease itself, but also integrating those lifestyle strategies, having strong community support, and patients being actively involved in their own care and in the research effort, too.
Yeah, it's this dynamic landscape, isn't it, where the science, the personal lived experience, and advocacy all intersect and hopefully keep pushing things forward.
And that really brings us towards the end of this particular deep dive into these sources on MS. We've kind of journeyed through the surprising complexities of genetics versus direct inheritance. We've explored the really crucial role that environmental triggers seem to play. We've seen the strategies people use for living well that go way beyond just medication.
No.
And we've looked at both the challenges and the hopes embedded in the ongoing research and patient advocacy efforts.
And when you consider everything, those striking family patterns, the emerging findings on specific genetic mutations like that Canadian study showed, the hint of parent of origin effects, plus the significant influence of environmental factors like EBV or vitamin D, it really leaves you with a pretty profound question, doesn't it?
Which is,
how close are we really to moving beyond treating symptoms and slowing progression? To actually being able to predict who's at highest risk, or maybe even preventing MS from developing in the first place.
wow, prediction or prevention? And if we could do that, accurately predict or prevent MS script, what would that fundamentally change? For all the individuals and families who currently live with that potential risk hanging over them, it's a powerful future to think about, isn't it? Stemming right from the insights in these sources.
The journey to fully understand MS is definitely far from over. But the insights we can glean from sources like the ones we looked at today, they offer both, I think, clarity on where we are now and a really compelling vision for what might eventually be possible.
Thank you for being with us until the end of this video. Please be sure to subscribe to the What Does Science Say channel and give us energy with your likes and comments. Share your comments with us and send the video to your loved ones so that others can also use it.